get started. So this session is mostly about containers, but specifically about how to deal with very large files. I'm sure all of us have experienced at some point of time either inheriting or winding up with a file that has very large file size, 50 gigabytes in size, because of the amount of container data that we're storing. And FileMaker makes it very easy to set up your file to maybe down the road end up with that as a problem. So we're going to talk about how to deal with those large apps, how to secure your storage, how to plan ahead for a system that stores a lot of container data. And we're going to discuss a little bit of thinking outside of the box with recent improvements to the FileMaker platform, what's available to us now for dealing with large container files. Not only large container files, but massive amounts of container data as well, hundreds of thousands of records. So a little bit about me. Most of you know me from around the community. I'm on the MVP community team. I'm on the Engage Advisory Council, and I also help beta test. Aside from that, I'm our technical lead at Mainspring, a platinum partner. I also manage our products, both our hosting and our vertical market applications, and I do training as well. Recently I've been doing a lot of web development as well to tie into the FileMaker platform. Specifically a fan of things like FM Better Forms for dealing with large-scale web applications that are driven by FileMaker on the back end. All right. So let's first talk about all of the different types of storage that's available to you with the FileMaker platform. We can store data in a number of different ways within your app files, and it's really important to understand these different ways because you're going to have to choose what's right for you. There's no single source of truth that this is the best way and everybody should use it. There's different tools, and some tools are better for jobs that that have specific goals in mind. So it's much easier to plan this at the beginning of a project when you're working on a file. But we're also going to talk about how to migrate data if you need to change this once it's grown to a very large size. So let's talk about these 4 blocks that I have up here on the screen. First off is your standard internal storage. When you create a container file or a container field in a FileMaker database, it defaults to internal storage. That's a file where it's going to store your container fields within the .fmp12 structure itself. Now the advantages to this method are it makes your file portable. Everything's self-contained, everything's in one .fmp12 file. It also inherits security, so if you encrypt that .fmp12 file, the contents of your data inside of that file also get encrypted. So it's a way to have your contents, your container contents, secured automatically within the file itself. But obviously the drawback is that's going to make your .fmp12 file very large, or potentially very large. As you start to store more and more container data in that file is going to start to grow. And that can lead to a lot of problems that you may not think about at the start of your projects. Things like disk space running out, things like your backups, they're going to take longer because FileMaker has to pause that database to take the full backup. So if you've got a 50 gigabyte file, that backup's going to take a long amount of time. And then if you multiply that by 7 days worth of backups, suddenly you have a need for over 300 gigs worth of drive space. So internal storage does have its advantages, but also you have to think about if I'm going to be storing a lot of records with containers attached to them, like photos for inspections or paperless document storage for like a law firm or something like that. Internal storage may not be a good choice. So you'll want to focus on kind of the server infrastructure so you can use external storage. So 2 types of external storage, secure and not secure. Secure means that FileMaker is going to take care of encrypting container data for you and kind of obfuscating it. So if anybody was to gain access maliciously to your container folder, they would not be able to decrypt those contents. They would basically see a bunch of files that were encrypted in a structure that didn't make sense to them. Now, this can have some drawbacks. So you might just want to store your container data externally but not encrypted. And in which case you will see a very different structure. You'll see a structure that notes your table name, your field name, and then a record ID, and then your container data itself will be stored inside of that folder. So you can actually programmatically recreate your data structure based on the folder structure there. So that might be good if you do need the ability to kind of look at your container data on disk and determine, like, what that file actually is. So if you're coming from an IT environment that has a traditional infrastructure of like a file server, where things are stored in a very structured format, then open storage, which is the default external storage, might be good for you. Now remember, you can also specify additional container folders, so you can store your container documents in different places using FileMaker Server's settings, which makes it a lot easier to deal with external storage. But the main benefit of external storage is that now that container data is not being stored in your database is only storing text data, and FileMaker controls the reference to track the files in external storage. In either case of external storage, one of the drawbacks of it is that it's a little fragile, because since it's stored separately than that .fmp12 file, if somebody deletes your container folder, suddenly everything's going to be gone. And in the case of something like external storage, if they delete that, even if you recover that folder, it may be very difficult to rejoin that container data back to your database, because it has to be linked by FileMaker. But again, if you're storing your container data in a .fmp12 file, that's also a single point of failure. So maybe you're going to have to talk to your IT people. You're going to have to come up with a security plan to figure out what the best option is for you. One of the other main benefits of external storage, though, is that backups, it reduces your file size for backups. So FileMaker's backup program is capable of creating symlinks or virtual links to track, the last time the file was changed. So if you're using internal storage to store everything, every time your file changes, it needs to back up the whole file. But if you're using external storage, you might have documents that are 2 years old, so maybe it only backs it up for the first backup, and then for subsequent backups it doesn't. It can just put a link back to that first backup because nothing has changed. So symlinks allow you to theoretically store a lot more things because they're just links to previous backups because nothing has changed. So that helps with disk space, especially for very, very large systems where you're dealing with hundreds of gigs worth of data. And then the last, which has recently become a lot easier to deal with in FileMaker, is linked storage. Now, if you remember, FileMaker used to have linked storage. You used to be able to store container fields only as a reference. And what this was is it was basically a system file path, c:users/bob/desktop/this file. The drawback to that was that usually that linked storage was to somebody's documents folder on their computer. So if I was looking at the database and there was a record that Bob put into the system, then maybe I don't have access to Bob's documents folder, so I wouldn't be able to see that file at all. So linked storage in the past has been kind of fragile, not as useful as internal or external storage, which is why it was deprecated and removed from the FileMaker platform. So this has since been replaced with what is a much better method of linked file storage. Now we have greatly expanded the abilities, especially in the last 5 years in the FileMaker platform, to deal with APIs, to deal with to have better interaction with the web viewer. So now we're thinking of link storage in a way that's not a traditional container field. So you no longer have a container field, you have a text field that stores a link somehow to a file that lives somewhere else. And that could be Dropbox, that could be somewhere on your local file server, on a NAS device, on a SAN inside of your network, could be AWS, could be a number of different places, could be just files from websites, just regular old plain URLs to links. But basically the idea of link storage is that container field is being, that container data is being stored and managed somewhere else that is not part of FileMaker's control, not the internal storage, not the external storage that FileMaker has built into it. So you then become responsible for transferring that container data to wherever that third-party host is, and then you store the link to that file within your FileMaker record so that you can reference that later. And when you reference it later, you could do things like use insert from URL to put it back into a global container field. And then you can use it like a regular container field in FileMaker. Or maybe you want to load it into a web viewer and just display the contents of the URL and let it stream through. So if you have very large video files, that could be a benefit of maybe maybe if all you're storing in your container data is video files, maybe you can integrate and upload those files to Vimeo or YouTube or somewhere, and then you store the links to that, and then you just use a web viewer to play those back. So you're not storing hundreds of gigs worth of video data in FileMaker. You're using a service that's designed to host videos and then only storing the links to those videos. So link storage has come a long way, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and have a demo file for you by a very good developer, Jason Wood. So let's move on. So yeah, well, to summarize here on storage, so think about all the ins and outs of your storage plan and make a plan. Really plan out what's the best idea for the app that you're building, and try to implement that plan as soon as possible in the development process, because the sooner you do it, the easier it's going to be. If you're switching from internal to external storage or back again, or internal to link storage, the sooner you do that and the sooner you transfer the data, the easier it will be. So a little bit about security. Think about this in the context of how you would normally plan this out. Who has access. That could be managed through privilege sets. You're also going to have to manage who has access to those files on the server if you're storing like external open storage. You need to figure out how to secure those files. So, where are those files being stored? How are those files deleted? How are they backed up? Is it part of FileMaker? If you're using linked storage, how are you backing up that linked storage? Because that's through a third party now. If you're using linked storage, how do those files get deleted? And then, are the files encrypted? Is FileMaker decrypting it? Is the third party decrypting it? All right. So eventually, all developers are going to face the prospect of moving a giant set of container data from one place to another. And I'm sure you've all tried this before. You've had a 40 gigabyte file or something, and you've just changed it from internal to external storage, and you've gone and you've hit that migrate button, and it starts migrating, and then FileMaker eventually locks up and crashes because it's so much data to try to move that you can't do it. So there's a couple different methods that I want to talk about migrating. Again, knowing these methods are are the important parts, so you can decide what's going to be best for you. And then coming up with a plan again for your migration is going to help you out in the long run. But every developer I know at some point of time has dealt with this problem. So that's a main point of focus I want to make here. So a word of warning is that certain types of storage may be more difficult to migrate to than others. Like it may be easier to migrate to linked file storage than it is to migrate from internal to external. So the main point here is how you migrate your files. That will determine the impact it will have on your app users. You might be doing this as a chunked process over the course of a few weeks, a little bit at a time. You might have downtime where you're doing it all in one go. You might be migrating to a new version of a file where you're starting from scratch and you have a legacy system and you have like a 2.0 version of your system. So let's talk about the methods of migrating. The first is the one that's the most common. It's just going into your FileMaker schema, making the change to your container field, internal to external, external to secure external, and then vice versa if you want to go backwards, secure external to non-secure or back to internal storage. This is the schema change method. You're changing the FileMaker schema. As soon as you save your database changes, FileMaker is going to calculate what it needs to do to migrate that, and it's going to ask you, to transfer those files. And this is just directly correlated to the size of container data you're dealing with. If you have, I would say, probably less than 15 gigabytes worth of data, then this method is usually pretty reliable, especially if you are using FileMaker on the same local network as your FileMaker server. So like if you're hosting an AWS server, maybe you spin up an AWS instance on that same subnet so that you can use FileMaker Pro just for doing this migration. You could probably install FileMaker Pro just on the server itself and use it locally as well. But again, you might not want to do that because it might take up a lot of resources and it might crash things out. So usually it's a better idea to be on the same local subnet, the same local network when you do this. So the best idea is to have just you connected when you're making these schema changes. The less people that have a chance of modifying records, the more chance you have of this being successful. But sit back, relax, make sure you have plenty of time, make the schema change, make sure that you take a backup of your file before you start this. Have that plan in mind. What are the steps I need to take to make this schema change? And then usually you can do that successfully. Now, if you're dealing with 100 gigs of data, maybe this isn't the way you do that. So the second method is something that I like to call the do-si-do scripted method, which is basically, rather than changing the schema itself, you add a container field. And when you add a container field that has the new specifications, so you have your first original container field that's maybe internal storage, then you have a second container field that's external secure. What this allows you to do is track and script and have complete control kind of over this migration process. So you can basically take the container fields from the original one and stick those container fields in contents into the new field. And that will let you go record by record, do incremental changes and log that. And I actually have a demo of this method a little bit later on. I say that even though we're running short on time here, so I'm going to try to speed up a little here. So basically, do-si-do is just taking it from one container field, sticking it in another container field, and moving on to the next record. So that allows you to check to see if it was successful. It allows you to check to see if a record's locked, that type of thing. All right, the export-import method's pretty self-explanatory. You just export your entire container contents, and then normally I prefer to actually truncate the table. So I'll export the entire table to its own standalone file, then I'll truncate that table, then I'll make the schema change the containers to how I need, and then go back and import the data back into the system. Now this usually works pretty good if maybe the schema change method isn't working for you. So, but this can also have its drawbacks. If you're dealing with a lot of container data, it's going to take a long time to import that data back. So again, try to do it on the same local network that your server's on so that I can do that as quickly as possible. Kind of eliminate the network lag as being something there. And then 4 is the API migration method, which only applies to if you're switching to linked container storage. But this is basically, you know, you have your container field, your original container field, you have your link field, you write a script that loops through each record, uploads it to your third-party API content network, and then stores that link, moves on to the next record. So 2 and 4 are pretty reliable here. Reliable methods for if you need to move a very large amount of data through. So again, knowing all of these different methods makes it easier to plan and be successful when you're dealing with a large amount of data. All right, so here's some tips on how to make these migrations easy. They're obviously going to be a big headache, so just make it easier on everyone by creating a plan. So your plan should include testing. Test your migration on a backup copy. Make sure that you budget enough time. If you're consulting for somebody, make sure you budget enough time to run a test. The test is going to be the most important part, because the first thing people are going to ask you are, well, how long are we going to be down for? How long is this going to take? And you're not going to know that unless you do a test. When you're talking to your customers or coworkers about this, make sure you outline what the benefits of the migration are. So if you're running out of disk space and you have a 200 gigabyte file and you're running out of disk space because you have a terabyte worth of backups, just, you know, define the benefit that, you know, our need for backup storage is going to go down if we do this migration. Obviously, make sure everything is backed up before you start. Have somebody peer review your plan and your test to make sure that, you know, when you finish testing, make sure that the container fields are still there. Have a regular user go in, make sure that everything looks right. Scroll through some records, make sure the container contents are there. Ensure that enough disk space is free. Obviously, if you get 75% through a migration and you run out of disk space, it's going to be a big issue. So there's probably going to be some overlap in time where you have, you're storing 2 copies of your container data. So make sure that you have enough disk space. You might have to maybe delete some older backups just to free up some disk space. Make sure that you're monitoring that disk space during the migration. So this is the resource file that will be included. It's just called container session. There's no login to get into this, but there's basically 6 things I want to point out in here. The first is FM Perception by Proofgeist, by my good friend Dave Ramsey. This utility is great for running a DDR and doing container contents. So if you're doing like the do-si-do method migration, where you're migrating everything to a new container field, FM Perception can be used to easily see every single reference in your file of that container field so that you can point that to the new container. So basically, after your migration, you can go back and update the schema of your file to make sure that any scripts, calculations, other fields, layout appearances, you know, everywhere that container field's being used, you can point it at the new container. So FM Perception is like my favorite tool for doing that. I talked about third-party container storage for linking files, and this both this blog post, this video, which is Jason's presentation, and this demo file that's included at the end here, download S3 demo, shows you pretty much a complete copy of how to integrate with, sorry, I'm trying to find this here, S3 demo, there we go. So this file shows you how to integrate with AWS S3 for storing container contents, how to link to those files, and then what's very important is how to display those contents once they're linked, rather than having a traditional container file in FileMaker. So very useful stuff. Make sure you show Jason your thanks for that resource. It's a great resource. Two things I want to go over in terms of schema examples. Right here, you're going to see how to calculate your file size. There's a nice let function in here that kind of shows you, takes your container field and gives you the file size. This is helpful for determining maybe which files in your system are very large. You can specify, you can kind of change stuff around in here as you see fit to use that. And then also while you're here, if you only store image contents in your database, you can use this AutoEnter calculation to automatically resize something. And this helps, you know, you're not going to be counting on your users to automatically resize the images before they upload them. So FileMaker's get thumbnail function can do that for you, basically automatically, so that you can save on storage space. And there's two script examples in here for you. One is our do-si-do batch migration, which is essentially, it's very well commented, but it shows you how to track things, how to restart from a different record. Maybe you can greatly modify this script for your own needs, but basically what it comes down to is you're taking your source field and you're setting your target field, and then everything around this is designed to make it a more robust process. So this is an example of a do-si-do batch migration. And then this one is an example of how to run a report that you might be delivering to your customers for determining what are the largest files in your system.